These things in Jesus' name. Amen. I want to start this morning with a question. What causes the wind? Or what causes rain, snow, thunder and lightning, or any weather phenomenon? There are two answers, right? The first is God. Verses like Job 37 tell us God loads the thick cloud with moisture, and the clouds scatter his lightning. Psalm 135:7 says, He it is, God, who makes the clouds rise at the end of the earth, who makes lightnings for the rain and brings forth the wind from its storehouses. So it's God. But there's another answer. As a former meteorologist, I can explain high and low pressure. I could bore you with all the details of how they form. I could explain isobars on the weather map and how those represent different pressures. And the closer those lines get, the tighter the gradient between high and low pressure. And the stronger the wind will be because the atmosphere is trying to bring equilibrium, right? It's working towards equilibrium. That causes the wind. I could also explain when air is lifted to its saturation point, it forms droplets of liquid, right? And when those droplets are big enough, gravity takes over and they fall, rain and snow. So it's both. Same with the grass and plants. What makes them grow? Psalm 104 tells us God causes the grass to grow. He does it for the livestock and plants for man to cultivate. But a botanist could bore us with an array of details that we really don't care about, why grass grows, seed and heat, photosynthesis, all that jazz. And the examples are endless in the natural world, aren't they? Who does these things? And hopefully we can see the answer is both. God is behind the scenes, moving, working, accomplishing his purpose. And at the same time, all these things are doing what they were designed to do. The world is operating the way it was designed to operate. What the laws of nature and gravity and physics compel them to do. They are operating the way God designed them and created them to do. So they're doing it, and God is doing it. We could say the same about nations, kings. There's a natural explanation as to why and how the Roman Empire was so vast. Why and how Europeans came to America. But just because there's natural explanations doesn't mean God wasn't working. Job 12 tells us God makes nations great, and he destroys them. God enlarges nations and leads some away. Proverbs 21, really famous, the king's heart is like water in God's hand, right? In the palm of the Lord. He turns it wherever he will. We could even narrow all of this down into our lives, which is where we're getting, right? Psalm 139 tells us so much about how God is intimately aware of us. Not just our thoughts, but each of our days before there were any of them, right? He even knows the hairs on our head. So what does all of this show us? It shows us that God is in charge, that God is sovereign. And at the very same time, he's working behind the scenes. God rules the world, but we do not see the obvious signs of his work. God is the primary actor, we could say. But his work is also shown in how he made things to be the way they are. Just like the laws of nature and physics, so too humanity works in a certain way. We were born and created a certain way, and both go hand in hand, and they work together in ways that we struggle to fully comprehend. Today we're going to go to the Bible to learn about one of the attributes articulated in our statement of faith that I didn't get to yet, which is God's sovereignty. If you remember, it's one of the 6 things I identified as most important about God. Here are the 6 things. There are others, but these are the 6 main things. That God is holy, that God is eternal, he has no beginning and no end, that he is creator, he created all that we see, that he is 3 and at the same time he is 1, he's the Trinity, that he planned and orchestrated salvation, and then today's topic, he's sovereign. Here's what I've been setting us up for, so we can understand that the Bible teaches 2 things very clearly. And these things seem to be in tension. But the Bible doesn't present them in tension. The Bible just affirms these 2 truths again and again and again. Here they are. Number 1, God is absolutely sovereign, and he ordains everything that comes to pass for his glory. God is absolutely sovereign. Everything he ordains. And number 2, we are fully accountable and responsible for our choices. We are fully accountable and responsible for our choices. So, we started with questions. Let's continue. Here's a simple one. Who threw Jonah into the sea? The Bible tells us in Jonah 1:15, they, which is the crew on the ship, were freaking out about the storm. They picked up Jonah and they hurled him into the sea, and the sea ceased from its raging. That's chapter 1, but just one chapter later, in Jonah 2, Jonah's speaking to God, and he says, you cast me into the deep, God, into the heart of the seas, and the flood surrounded me. All your waves and your billows passed over me. So who threw him in? The answer is both, right? God was acting behind the scenes, and yet at the same time, the crew on the ship, of their own volition and their own determination, picked him up, threw him overboard. It's both. God is primary, and the crew secondary. Now, it gets a little more tricky elsewhere when these feel more in tension, when God's not only in control, but humans are held accountable. Here's another question. Who caused David to take a census? In 2 Samuel 24:1, we read, the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel, and he incited David against them, saying, go number Israel and Judah. So David does that. And 9 verses later, David feels remorse. He says, I've sinned by doing it. He owns it himself. It says David's heart struck him after he had numbered the people. And David said to the Lord, I have sinned greatly in what I have done. But now, O Lord, please take away the iniquity of your servant, for I have done very foolishly. David knew he did it of his own volition. He determined to do something against God's rules and acknowledged his sin. He didn't blame God. He didn't say, you made me do this. He took responsibility. Here's the thing. Truth one, God alone has absolute freedom to do as he pleases. God upholds, directs, and rules all creation, all creatures, all actions, working all things for the sake of his name, for his own glory. He sits in the heavens and he does all that he pleases, right? None can stay his sin. None can thwart his purposes. And at the very same time, truth number two, our choices are real. We can determine to make choices and decisions and voluntarily act. We know this because there are real consequences. We are held responsible for our actions. This is obvious from the myriad of commands in the Bible. And those commands come with blessings for obedience and curses for disobedience. God's justice tells us this is true, that we rightly have these decisions. A just God would not hold us accountable if we weren't responsible for the choices we make. So thankfully, not only does our denomination have a statement of faith, they also provide a book to help with these nitty-gritty kind of understanding what we believe and why. And I just want to read a portion of what's written about God's sovereign power. Here's what they write. I hope this is helpful. While affirming God's sovereignty, we believe that that sovereignty never minimizes human responsibility. Do you feel them in tension? And while we are morally responsible creatures, making significant choices to obey, rebel, believe, etc., and are rightly held responsible for our actions, we can never make God absolutely contingent upon our wills. They go on. However we formulate the notion of human freedom, we affirm that nothing can thwart God's gracious purpose. His exhaustive foreknowledge includes even the future acts of human beings, even future acts regarded as free acts. And his omnipotence entails that nothing is outside his sovereign will. With all that said, let's just be real. When we try and understand how all of this works out logically and rationally, it can make our brains hurt. It can make us throw up the white flag, right? I think grappling with God's sovereignty leaves us with 3 really big questions. There may be more, but there's at least 3. Things that we don't fully get. Things that cause us to scratch our heads and wonder, how can this be? Not in a rebellious way, but in a way like, I believe God's word. When I read it, I want to believe it. I want to know. I know it's true, but it's hard for me to make sense of it. So how could this be? Here are the 3 questions, at least, I think, that raises. 1, are we really free? Are we really free? 2, what about the problem of evil? What about the problem of evil? And 3, which maybe some of you are thinking, okay, wait, does this mean we're talking about predestination? Okay, so number 3 we're going to set aside. It might be 3 sermons, right? It's likely going to be its own sermon. And I'm not sure when we're going to get to it, possibly when we get to the Holy Spirit and his regenerating work. What I will say is that our statement of faith, if you're thinking about that, it intentionally allows room for both. Those who see the Bible through the more Arminian point of view and those who see the Bible through a more Calvinistic point of view. Both are welcome, okay? And I really appreciate that about our denomination. But I want to try and answer the first 2 questions. The first is freedom. You may have noticed that I haven't used the term free in this discussion. I try and steer clear of that word because there's so much potential for misunderstanding. I prefer to talk in terms of how we have real choices, how we make real determinations. We have real choices. We're not robots. Our choices are not forced upon us by God. We do not believe in a fatalistic determinism, that we only do what God forces us to do. As I said, God's justice proves that we really have real choices, because a just God would not punish us for something we do not voluntarily choose to do. And that's the word, voluntary, that I prefer. I think it's helpful. An old theologian, St. Bernard, connected the dots. He said, among all living beings, man alone is free. And he says this, for what is voluntary is also free. What is voluntary is also free. This connects us back with what we talked about last week in regards to the human condition and our union with Adam. We believe we're sinners by nature and choice. And the early church fathers, we covered this last week, they affirmed that by nature we are now not able not to sin. Remember the double negative? We're now not able not to sin. That's our nature. Sinners by choice, sinners by nature. Sin has distorted the way we bear God's image. None of our motives are entirely pure. None of our intentions entirely praiseworthy. Nothing escapes sin's defilement. And because of that, we voluntarily sin. Not just that, we choose it. We pursue it. It's like we crave self-rule, to be our own boss and reject God. We do this voluntarily. We choose it. And we're held responsible by God. The other reason I avoid the word free is because there is only one who is absolutely free in all the universe. It's God. His freedom sits above everything else. He alone is absolutely free. His freedom is ultimate. It's not impeded. It's not interrupted. It's not superseded by our freedom. Though we may be free, our freedom is under His. And I want to reread part of what I read earlier from our denomination. We can never make God contingent upon our wills. However we formulate the notion of human freedom, we affirm that nothing can thwart God's gracious purpose. In what is probably one of the hardest chapters of the Bible to wrap our minds around, because it deals with this issue alongside the issue of election, Romans 9, we see something helpful. And I don't want to dive too deep into Romans 9. We'll probably get to that in another sermon. But he brings up our choices and the consequences under God's sovereignty. And in that chapter, he affirms that we're responsible because we can choose. And he asks, you will say to me then, why does he still find fault? For who can resist his will? Okay? A legitimate question some of us may ask. Since God is just and he still holds us accountable, we may wonder why. How can God still find fault? Who can resist his will? Paul's answer is pretty short and sweet, but I think it's instructive. He says, who are you, O man, to answer back to God? Will what is molded say to its molder, why have you made me like this? He returns to this idea we started with. We are made a certain way by God. Made with volition and determination, made in such a way that we are free, or we make voluntary choices under his sovereignty. And he adds the unavoidable fact that God is God and we are not. At the end of the day, there's a humbling that happens, right? God is creator and we are created. And that isn't meant to just shut us up. It's not like this parent who screams at their kids, because I'm the parent, slams the door. That's not at all what Paul is saying. It's meant to realign us to the reality of being created by God under his gracious and loving authority. I hope that's helpful in thinking about our voluntary choices and how God leaves room for that. Now, the second part of the question, or the second question is much more difficult, the problem of evil. Certainly, I can't do an exhaustive study on this, but I hope that some things I say are helpful. Let's be crystal clear about what the Bible teaches. God is not the author of evil. God did not create it. He is not responsible for any sin. God is perfectly pure, the only truly righteous one. Here's a few verses that we know this from. 1 John 1:5. This is the message we have heard from him and proclaimed to you, that God is light, and in him is no darkness at all. God is pure. He is pure light, no darkness at all. Psalm 5. You are not a God who delights in wickedness. Evil may not dwell with you. Evil may not dwell with you. Not just evil, but God is not the one who even tempts us towards evil. That's what James 1 tells us. Let no one say when he's tempted, I am being tempted by God. Why? For God cannot be tempted with evil, and he himself tempts no one. So how are we tempted? We're tempted when we're lured and enticed by our own desire, right? Back to our union with Adam. Sinners by nature and by choice. Now, before I go any further on this question, I want us to pause and consider the alternative. Here's the alternative. What would God be if he did create evil? What would God be if he was somehow responsible for it? What's more, what would God be if it were somehow outside his control or out beyond his reach, that he was like, oh, I don't know what to do with this? What would God be if there was an evil power equal to him, or it surprised him, or came about without his knowledge? I hope it's painfully obvious how bad any of those realities would be. And we must reject these ideas. None of them can describe the God of the Bible. If we think through these, we see why. If God did evil or was the cause of it, we'd conclude that he is not good after all. We'd conclude that he is not righteous or pure, that he'd be stained. And that goes against the core of who he is. He would no longer be God. He'd just be a bigger or stronger version of us. So we must reject that. And if we determine there is evil that God did not intend, evil that's not under his control or doesn't fulfill his purpose, what a loathsome position we would be in. We could no longer have any hope that God could use all things to work for good, as Romans 8 so graciously promises. What guarantee would we have that there would not be more evil that God doesn't want or doesn't intend? What guarantee would we have that something would not surprise God or upend him? What hope would we have that God could win the ultimate victory? What hope would we have? We'd have none. He'd no longer be ultimately sovereign. Something else would be more powerful than him. This would be tragic on so many levels, and so we reject that as well. With all that said, I want to start at the beginning and find out where evil and where sin came from. If it's not created by God, where did it originate? Now, on that question, the Bible is silent-ish. We affirm God's original creation was very good, without sin. But at some point between Genesis 1 and Genesis 3, sin entered in. And that's where I said the Bible's kind of silent-ish. It doesn't come out and directly say it, but there are hints in Isaiah 14, in Ezekiel 28, in 2 Peter, and in Jude, that when we kind of piece these together, it helps us get some sense of what happened. There's this common belief that the angels did not accept their assigned place. They wanted to be God, and so they rebelled. And Satan is understood to be the angel that led this rebellion, and evil came from inside of him. Satan then approached Adam and Eve in the garden to tempt them with the same thing, that they could be like God, that they could reject God's rule and rule themselves. Evil didn't come from God. Creation was corrupted by angels who fell. And again, if you want to study that a little bit more, some places in Isaiah 14, Ezekiel 28, 2 Peter, and Jude kind of explain some of those things. So God is not the author of sin. He did not create it. But at the very same time, we must acknowledge that God allowed it. Okay? God allowed it. And this is a difference here that's important. If God did not allow sin, and it's here, we would go back to what we started with this loathsome position where God's not the top dog. So we acknowledge God allowed sin to enter our world. Why? We don't know. That's a mystery, right? But since he's wiser than us, since he knows the end from the beginning, nothing can thwart his purposes, because he's God and we are not, we must have a good reason for doing so. So what are we left with? God sovereignly rules the world in such a way that though all good and evil actions are directed by him, at the same time, God is not responsible for human sin. Instead, we are held responsible for our choices. So how does God interact with evil and sin? He's not the author of it, but he's still sovereign over all things. So how does that work? Okay, I want to finish by saying there's at least 4 ways God carries out his providence over sin. And I want to talk about each of these briefly. God carries out his providence by preventing sin, by permitting sin, by directing sin, and by limiting sin. Preventing, permitting, directing, and limiting. First, God prevents sin. Psalm 19:13, keep back your servant from presumptuous sins. Let them not have dominion over me. Then I shall be blameless and innocent of great transgression. That's the prayer. God, prevent me from sinning. Like all the others, happens behind the scenes, and we rarely see what God has prevented, but it happens, and the psalmist asks for God to graciously prevent him from sinning, and God can do that. God also permits sin. Romans 1, maybe one of the most well-known verses along those lines. God gives us over to our lusts and our passions. He permits us to sin. Therefore, God gave them up in the lusts of their hearts to impurity, to the dishonoring of their bodies among themselves, because they exchanged the truth about God for a lie and worshipped and served the creature rather than the Creator. God gave them over. He permits sin. This may seem obvious since there's sin in the world, but a right view of God's sovereignty recognizes it exists because God permits it to exist. But God also directs sin. God directs sin. Since sin is all he's got to work with, if his purposes are going to get done, it will happen because God directs sin. Genesis 50 is one of the most well-known examples of this. This is the story of Joseph and his brothers, right? Think of all the sin that led to Joseph being where he ended up. Hated by his brothers, thrown in a pit, sold to slave traders. Then they lied to try and cover up their hideous actions. And what does Joseph say to them when they're reunited? God sent me here ahead of you. God directed your sin. And then when his brothers are worried about him getting revenge, he uttered these words, as for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good. What does that mean except for that God meant the sin for good? God directed the sin for good to bring it about that many people should be kept alive as they are today. This is good news. God can direct sin. God can turn it. He can twist it. He can shape it. He can form it for his good purposes. This gives us hope. And finally, God limits sin. This is similar to preventing, but he limits the extent to which sin can go on. In the most clear example in the Bible, God puts limits on what Satan can do to Job. First, he says, do not touch Job. And that's in chapter 1. Then in chapter 2, God says, do whatever you want to Job, only spare his life. In both instances, Satan can only go so far as God allows. He's limited. But this brings us to a question that we can't fully answer. If God can limit and prevent sin, why do horrible and awful things happen in this world? Right? This is hard. Why does he allow atrocities, mass murders, and school shootings? These are hard questions. And we can start with the answer God gave Job. God's rebuke to Job was that you aren't God. Were you there when I created Leviathan? Right? Do you know all that I know? Only God knows all things. Only God understands all things, and on and on. But the other part of the answer is we don't and we can't fully comprehend how all the pieces fit together and how God's going to work. We also lack a concept of eternity and how God has that long to right all the wrongs that happen. We see just a sliver of eternity. But God has eternity to work out his perfect justice and the sovereign power to do it. And now, this last answer may seem trite. It might seem uncaring. I don't mean it that way at all. But we acknowledge on some level that without seeing and understanding how dark and black and awful sin is, we wouldn't truly understand how awesome and wonderful God is. You see, when we face tragedy like we did this week, we're forced to stare into the dark abyss of sin, right? Forced to look at it and wonder how and why it happened. And then something inside of us happens. Can we ever have hope? We wonder where our hope is placed. You know, we don't appreciate the sunrise until we walk through the darkest part of the night. And God may very well allow the exact amount of evil he has shown to contrast his goodness. He may allow it to inch us ever closer towards him. And some may have such trouble with the question of how a good God can allow evil that they abandon faith. They reject the existence of God. And I think that's a mistake. I think it's an understandable mistake because of how evil and dark and heavy it may feel at times. I think it's a mistake to abandon belief in God because you think it somehow will make the problem of evil somehow easier to handle. It does not make tragedy or suffering or injustice go away. It doesn't undo what has happened. It doesn't provide a better answer. In fact, recognizing evil is to recognize things are not as they should be. When we're outraged, it's because we acknowledge and understand that goodness exists somewhere, right? The animal kingdom has no such problem with killing and slaughtering each other. Why is that? Why do we? What's innate inside of us? What's implanted inside of us to make us know that's wrong? Don't you think it's the fingerprint of God? The truth that there is good, that God created good. Things are not the way we are. We grieve and we moan. Why? Because something inside of us that says it's not the way it should be. It's been corrupted. I want to end by pondering another question. We started with what causes the wind. Let's finish with this one. Who killed Jesus? Who killed Jesus? The Bible gives so many potential answers. Judas in Mark 14, woe to that man by whom the Son of Man is betrayed. Or in Acts 4, we see so many other options. For truly in this city were gathered together against your holy servant, both Herod and Pontius Pilate, along with Gentiles, the people of Israel. So who killed Jesus? There's a lot of answers. Judas, by his own willful choice, betrayed Jesus. The Jewish leaders, as well as the people that were gathered that day, were given an option to release him. But by their own self-righteousness and disgust, they cried out again and again, crucify him, crucify him. Herod, Pontius Pilate, the Roman soldiers who led him up to Calvary, drove stakes through his hands and feet. All would be accurate answers. But at the end of the day, we see this plan was in the works for a long time. God was moving and directing. From the foundation of the world, there was this plan that Jesus would come in the fullness of time, and his mission was clear. He would die for the sins of the world. God's sovereign control is articulated in Acts 2, where Peter says, this Jesus delivered up according to the definite plan and foreknowledge of God. Who killed Jesus? He says, by the definite plan and foreknowledge of God, you crucified and killed by the hands of lawless men. Do you hear that? It was God's plan. It was by his foreknowledge. And in some way that we can't fully wrap our brains around, God directed all these people to act within their own choice, within their own volition, to voluntarily choose to bring about what God determined would happen. And now because of Jesus' death in our place, here's what belief in God gets you in the face of the problem of evil. The Christian God. Belief in a God who did not run away from evil. Belief in a God who did not flee the scene and did not give up on us. Belief in a God who actually provides a solution to the problem and hope for the future. We must see that Jesus didn't remove himself. He didn't stay hidden in his palace when his people were suffering and in anguish. Jesus entered in. He got in the midst of our suffering. Jesus knows firsthand what despair and rejection and loneliness and pain feels like. He knows what it's like to lose someone you love, to live in poverty, to be tortured, and even experience what we would call the dark night of the soul. God entered in. He entered the pain and the hurt and the despair that evil causes. Why he allowed it, we don't know, but he entered in and he knows. That was God's plan. Not just to fix the brokenness, but he fixed it by entering into it. He fixed it by entering into it, and he can fix your brokenness by entering into yours. Through suffering and pain and anguish, he redeemed us and gives us hope. That's the God of the Bible. That's the God who sovereignly rules and reigns over sin. That's the God we hope in. So this is what we affirm about God. That he is good. That he is loving and kind and gracious. He is eternal. He's creator, he's sovereign, he's three, and at the same time he's one. We affirm that God is holy and that for eternity past he planned redemption through Jesus Christ to reconcile us and bring us to himself and to fix what we broke. That's our hope. Let's pray together.